Hello friends, this is Eli from Mystic Circuits. Today we will be going over the fundamental principles and operation of ANA 2, our most recent module, which for the sake of brevity I will be referring to just as ANA for the rest of this video. ANA is at its core an analog logic processor, which means that it takes two signals and creates a variety of output signals that are mathematically computed from both of the input signals. There are some pretty common options for analog processing circuits here, such as the ability to add, multiply, and compute the minimum or maximum of the two input signals. However, ANA also contains several circuits that are completely original for unique wave shaping and cross-modulation options. The best part of ANA is that all 9 of its processing circuits are available simultaneously, meaning that ANA will always give you more than what you put into it. ANA is the first module returning from our pre-pandemic product line. As many of you know, the pandemic and resulting component shortage caused a lot of issues for synthesizer manufacturers, as many common parts were no longer available. This also caused the closing of many synthesizer companies, some of whom were already planning on retiring and decided to do so early, while others could no longer afford the regular cost of operating a business. One of those companies was our original manufacturer, and when they closed, I had to adapt to a different workflow and assembly process. This ended up being a blessing in disguise, because when I looked back at my previous modules, I saw that there was a lot of room for improvement, and rather than just rushing a redesign that would get things back in stock quickly, I decided to start the process from the ground up and see how much better I could make everything. I think if you look at the difference between ANA 1 and ANA 2, you can see how much extra functionality we crammed into the same amount of space. Expect similar reworks of a few of our other pre-pandemic modules. Adding utilities to your case is sort of like brushing your teeth. It's something that you know you have to do, but unless you're a real freak, you probably don't get any enjoyment out of it. With ANA, we did our best to maintain the predictability and usefulness of the module, while also maintaining its ability to surprise you with its wackiness. While it can behave like a normal attenuverter or mixer when you need it to, it's also possible for ANA to be a truly nasty distortion, a weird modulation enabler, and a screwy sequence scrambler. The best part of ANA is that the simultaneous outputs for all of its different circuits make it so that you can use a single output for its intended purpose, or plug each output throughout your patch to have a single knob change the behavior of the entire system. In order to understand what ANA is doing in our patches, we need to go over some basics of Boolean and analog logic and also cover the differences between them. Boolean logic is a form of algebra invented by George Boole, where the inputs and outputs of the equation are ones and zeros representing a true or false statement respectively. This is particularly useful in programming and especially early analog computational circuits, where microcontrollers were either not available or not affordable. A Boolean equation can be thought of as a statement where if the following setup of circumstances are all true, then the outcome is true. As an example, if I'm in a car and I am waiting for a stoplight and the light just turned green, then I should push the gas pedal. It lends itself nicely to electronics, where the input and output of different Boolean logic circuits can all be ones and zeros, made out of square wave signals moving around your circuit. These signals can be created by stepping on a pressure plate, a temperature sensor passing a certain threshold, or, in our case, a trigger sequencer. In a synthesis context, there are 2 Boolean logic gates which come up the most frequently and which you may have already heard of: the AND gate and the OR gate. The AND gate acts like a sort of valve for gates going through it, where the output will only go high when both inputs are high, as in when A and B are true, then the output is true. This allows you to either pass or choke a gate signal with a second gate signal. The OR gate behaves more like a way to add multiple gate signals together, as in when A or B is true, then the output is true. This is a particularly useful gate for adding something that generates fills or less predictable trigger sequences to a normal trigger sequence. There is a third, slightly more esoteric logic gate that is common in the world of synthesizers, and that is the XOR gate, which only outputs a true value when only one of its inputs is true. This can be thought of as a gate-controlled logic inverter, meaning that you can invert whether or not the gate is a true or false value with another gate stream. At audio rate, this can result in some really interesting ring modulation sounds. These circuits are all quite useful in the world of synthesizers, but they have a major drawback. They only work with gate signals. This means that if we put something in like a sine wave at the input of our Boolean logic circuit, that sine wave will be transformed into a square wave before it hits the logic circuit, and then the output of the logic circuit will still be a square wave. Using a more advanced sort of circuit allows us to do Boolean logic computation on non-gate analog signals, resulting in something called analog logic. With analog logic, if you put in gate signals, the circuits will still compute the original Boolean logic function and output a gate. But with other sorts of signals, the output will be processed in such a way that the original signal type is maintained. This means that with ANA, if you put in gates, you get out gates. If you put in LFOs, you get out LFOs. If you put in audio, you get out audio. If you put in note sequences, you get out note sequences. However, when you put in a combination of these various signal types, the results will straddle the line between all of these different signal types that are coming in, resulting in a bizarre blending of shapes that might yield unexpected results. The main analog logic functions that are the basis of ANA are the min, max, XOR, and mag functions. Min computes the minimum of both inputs, and in this context behaves like an AND gate because you need both inputs to be high in order to output a high voltage. Max computes the maximum of both inputs and behaves like an OR gate because either input being a high voltage will output a high voltage. XOR obviously behaves like an XOR gate, but because the output is bipolar, it will sometimes invert the signal in ways that are unlike a normal XOR gate, and therefore requires some work to behave like a traditional XOR with gate inputs. On the other hand, mag computes the magnitude or the subtraction between both inputs and outputs a high voltage when the two inputs are far away from each other. This will result in an XOR process for gates, which behaves much more similarly to a traditional Boolean XOR. I hope you didn't skip that last section, because there will be a test at the end of this video. Anyways, ANA 2 has a number of significant improvements that either add completely new capabilities or small quality of life improvements to the design when compared to the original ANA. I have them both sitting here next to each other so that we can illustrate a couple of the differences. Visually, ANA 2 comes with these two LED windows indicating the final value of both of the input processing sections before they're sent to ANA's cross-modulation circuits. As you can see, turning each knob changes the brightness and color of the LED, indicating the value of the output of that input section. I'll just mention briefly that when the output section goes positive, the LED turns green. It's a little hard to see in this lighting, but trust me that it's green. And then as I turn it to the left, the output voltage goes negative and the light turns red. When a quickly moving signal such as audio or a fast LFO is crossing the boundary between the two LED colors very quickly, it might appear to be orange or yellow. This is the result of both LED colors mixing together faster than your eye can process. Another visual improvement of ANA 2 over the original is that the panel graphics are much less cluttered and more legible. The circles indicating the magnitude and polarity of the control knobs are no longer broken up with all of these little lines here, and you can see it sort of matches the design language of the rest of our modules with the gradually increasing circles of different color. I also might draw your attention to these interwoven circles, which I think are much cleaner than on the original, and they're actually woven together. That took a lot of time on my end. I really do feel like this is some of the best panel art that I've made so far. Functionally, there are some significant improvements from the original version of ANA. As you can see, there's an entirely new row of jacks going down the middle of the module. Actually, the two rows of jacks on either side of ANA 2 are the same as the jacks that are on ANA 1. And if you want to get essentially the same behavior as you did on ANA 1, if you're already familiar with that module, you can just use the outputs on each side of ANA 2. The new jacks on ANA 2 in the middle column include 2 new inputs and 3 new outputs. The 2 inputs are bipolar VCAs, which are applied to the main inputs on the left side of the module. So the way it goes is basically your main input multiplied with the multiply input and then added to the sum input. And that's the same for each channel. On a previous version of ANA, many users requested the ability to be able to precisely voltage control the functionality of the attenuverter knobs. And I felt like at the time, my thinking was that the sum inputs would get you pretty close, but we decided that bipolar VCAs were the right way to go in order to implement this functionality on version 2. Now, I will briefly mention that bipolar VCAs are notoriously difficult to zero out, so you should expect some bleed when using these for audio. As far as the new outputs go, one stands out right away, the mix output. I have no idea why I didn't include this in the original ANA, but honestly, I think that I wanted to focus on other more interesting processes with the amount of space that I had, and felt that a mix might be better accomplished with another module. Now, especially with the inclusion of the VCA inputs, the mix output seemed like an obvious choice. Not only does this mean that you can use ANA as a boring old attenuvert offset, but also ANA can be used as a 4-channel mixer with voltage control and gain over 2 of those channels. This output is also useful for getting to see exactly what the input processing sections are up to. Next up is the cut output. This is by far the hardest output to describe and is probably the most unique of all the processing circuits now on ANA. This output can be a perfect recreation of either input, depending on the knob positions, but when it is between, it becomes a bizarre combination with a sort of zigzag kink in the middle. We'll go over this output in more detail later. The final new output is the swap output, which is a 2-channel switch. This output, similar to the step output, uses gate signals created by the box output as its control source. Here on the scope, I have just a short demonstration. The box output is shown in yellow, and the swap out is shown in red. And then I have 2 control signals, which are the blue and green traces, which are just sine waves that are in phase with each other. So basically, box is a bipolar comparator, which creates a 3-level square wave, which you can see on the scope can be either positive, negative, or 0. Whenever box is positive, channel 1 is switched on. Whenever box is negative, channel 2 is switched on. Whenever box is 0, neither input is switched on. This is quite handy for getting choppy cut-up signals, but is also an incredible distortion. As mentioned earlier, one of the older outputs that's been improved is step. The step output is a track and hold, similar to a sample and hold, that uses both of its inputs to determine its sampling and clocking behavior. In the previous version of ANA, only input 1 would actually be sampled, while both inputs would be used to determine the clocking behavior. Now, ANA 2 samples both of its inputs and then adds the results together. When one input is being sampled by the track and hold circuit for that channel, the most recently held value of the other channel is being added to the step output. This means that the newly revised step output is sort of like having 2 of the older step outputs added together. So now we're going to go ahead and just listen to the difference. You can hear ANA 1 step output here. You can get some changes in the clocking behavior by changing input 2. And again, the inputs are the green and blue sine waves. ANA 1's output is this yellow trace, but you can see that changing all of this, it really only changes the level of the original sine wave. In order to change the clocking behavior more significantly, we have to change the input signals, right? So now I'm going to switch to ANA 2, which is this red wave you can hear already. It sounds a lot more interesting. You can see on the trace, it looks a lot more interesting, and you can see changing either of the channels has a really significant effect on what the output is doing. So I'll go ahead and change this. And you can also hear the second input a lot more significantly than you could before as well. Anna's input section provides a number of ways to process incoming signals before they hit the cross-modulation circuits. This is handy not only to make sure that your signals are occupying the right range of voltages, but also to change the way that each channel's control knob functions. Depending on how each channel's input section is patched, that channel's control knob can act either as an attenuverter, offset, or a static voltage. Using multiple parts of the input section can combine these processes to lead to even more complex behavior. The input section comprises the top 6 jacks on Anna, which are separated from the output section because they are not surrounded by silver. Each channel's input section comprises of 2 identical rows of 3 jacks, with channel 1's inputs being on the top and channel 2's inputs being on the bottom. The inputs from left to right are the main channel input, the multiply input, and the sum input. With nothing patched into any of the jacks for a given channel's row of inputs, the relevant channel knob will behave like a static voltage. This can be useful for allowing manual control of the wave shaping circuits, or for providing a second static parameter for the other channel's input signal processing. To have the relevant channel's control knob behave like an attenuverter, patch your incoming signal to the main input on the left. When patched this way, the process signal will be at its lowest value when the control knob is at noon. Turning the knob clockwise from this position will increase the output signal's magnitude gradually. Past about 3 o'clock and some gain will be added to the output signal. Going in the other direction, turning the control knob counterclockwise past noon will again increase the output signal's magnitude, but with its voltage polarity inverted. Now we can patch a second signal into the multiply input. This engages our 4-quadrant VCA, multiplying the signal at the main input with the signal at the multiply input. The channel control still behaves like an attenuverter, but it is altering the polarity and magnitude of the entire multiplied signal. As mentioned before, bipolar VCAs are difficult to completely zero out. Therefore, if you're using it with a unipolar control voltage such as an envelope or a gate, this might result in some signal bleed in the output. If you would like to try a different VCA where minimizing bleed was a high priority in the design, consider checking out our other module, 3D VCA. Keep in mind that patching to the multiply input with nothing patched into the main input will result in normal attenuverting behavior as if you were patching to the main input. To have the relevant channel's knob behave like an offset, patch your incoming signal into the sum input on the right. Signals patched in here can be shifted up or down using the knob, without their amplitude being affected. When using the main and multiply inputs, the knob will behave like an attenuverter for the multiplied signals, and signals patched into the sum input will be added to the result. Now we will be going over each output one by one and providing a few quick snippets on how each output can process gates, modulation, note sequences, and audio. I will be using the exact same sources for each output's demonstration, but may change the input patching and channel controls to give the best example of how these different sections work. The outputs are arranged somewhat logically from top to bottom. The top row contains the most common outputs that you're likely to find on other modules. The second row contains outputs that are designed to provide more subtle wave shaping with smoother transitions. The third row contains the most intense outputs that warp incoming signals the most and have sharp, abrupt transitions in voltage level. Here are the outputs in order. The min output computes the minimum of the 2 input channels. This output will clip the top of incoming waves, limiting the output to the lower portion of its overall voltage range. On a sine wave, it sounds like this. The mix output computes the sum of the two input channels, acting like a simple mixer for them both. When using this output with fluctuating voltage sources, this output can be particularly useful as an attenuvert offset. Simply patch your signal into the main input on channel 1 and leave channel 2 unpatched. Now, the control knob for channel 1 behaves like an attenuverter, and the channel 2 control knob behaves like an offset. I'm going to go ahead and spare you what this sounds like with a sine wave, and also what it does for modulation. The max output computes the maximum of the two input channels. When using this output with fluctuating voltage sources, this output will clip the bottom portion of the wave, limiting the output to the higher portion of its overall range. On a sine wave, it sounds like this. As you can hear, this effect is very similar to what you hear with min. However, when the min output's effect is more engaged, the max output is less engaged, and vice versa. I have on the scope here the yellow trace being the max output and the red trace being the min output. You can see that changing the threshold voltage with channel 2 will set the effect to be more or less engaged on each channel. You can sort of think of these two as a seesaw that act conversely with each other. The XOR output is a bipolar clipper using the same diode logic as the min and max outputs. This output is actually the same as the original VCA output found in the same location on our original version of ANA. While we added the built-in bipolar VCAs, I felt like the name XOR was more descriptive and points to a few key differences with a normal bipolar VCA. The first is that instead of attenuating incoming voltages and then flipping them over, which is what you would expect out of a VCA, this output actually reduces the overall volume of the signal by clipping it, right? And then as it goes through 0, it reverses the polarity of the wave but still clips it until it becomes a completely original version of the signal. So as you can see, clipping versus attenuation, right? Completely different effect. This sets XOR apart from other bipolar VCAs by having the output distort as the VCA closes instead of distorting when the VCA is open. Here's what it sounds like with the sine wave. The cut output is by far the hardest to explain and the most unique output on ANA. I'm not going to just wave my hands and say that it's a mystery. This is how it works. It takes the XOR output, subtracts it from each input, and then adds the results together. What this does in effect is something like a blend between a crossfader and a wavefolder. Something that's unique and important about this output is that it's the only output besides the mix output that can smoothly transition between both input channels without any distortion when the channel controls are set to specific values. One of the great things about this is that cut is a great way to blend between multiple kinds of signals without changing their overall signal levels. When using cut to blend, for example, a bipolar LFO and a unipolar envelope, cut is able to make seamless transitions between the two, while also making a spicy blend of both, while in the middle of that transition. For audio, it's also great to add some extra beef without completely destroying the signal. This is one that I'm going to just suggest you'll need to experiment with to get an intuitive feel for it, rather than trying to tame it and understand it. I will mention, though, that in a lot of settings, this output will have a larger negative amplitude than positive amplitude. You will also notice this characteristic kink in the middle of the signal as it moves around the 0 volt line. Here's what it sounds like with a sine wave. computes the magnitude, or absolute difference, between both inputs. Basically what this means is that it subtracts both inputs, but keeps the output always positive. This is, in my opinion, one of the most useful outputs on ANA, because it does two important things. It's an output that is always positive, no matter what's going on with the inputs or knob settings, and it changes whenever either input changes. Here's how it sounds on a sine wave. The step output is a pseudo-random processor based around a similar circuit as used in the surge smooth step generator. The track and hold circuit used for this output algorithm is similar to a sample and hold, except that it will pass through the input while the clock signal is high, and then hold the most recent output when the clock signal goes low. This means that not only do you get a mix of smooth and staircase-shaped signals coming through this circuit, but also that it responds to the pulse width of the clock signal, whereas a normal sample and hold will only react to its rising edge. If that doesn't make sense, don't worry. Basically, the step output makes stair-step shapes out of your inputs. I mentioned this before, but this output has actually been changed from the previous version of ANA. Not only is the performance of the track and hold much better as far as response time and signal droop goes, but also there are now actually two track and hold circuits which are sampling both inputs and then adding them together. This means that the new version of step is basically like having two of the previous step outputs combined. Step is most useful when there are two inputs going in rather than a single input and a static voltage. Here's what it sounds like with two sine waves going in. The swap output is a two-channel switch that alternates between either channel or no signal. This is the last of the new outputs to cover, and it's a pretty simple one. This output is great for making sharp transitions between various outputs that cause a lot of overtones for audio and quick jumps for modulation. Here's how it sounds on a sine wave. The box output is a window comparator that creates a three-level square wave based on the relative behavior of the inputs. This square wave can be either positive, zero, or negative, and in my opinion is much more dynamic than just having a two-value square wave. One benefit of this output is that no matter what you're patching into ANA, it will give you gates. Usually when patching into a voice, I use this output to trigger the envelope and step output to drive the pitch, either through a quantizer or without it. Something interesting to note is that the logic signals coming from this output are used to drive both the swap and step outputs. When the box output is high, the swap output is passing channel 1 and the step output is sampling channel 1. When box is 0, swap is also 0, and step is holding both track and holds. When box is negative, swap is passing channel 2, and step is sampling channel 2. This means that all three outputs have a sort of mirrored behavior between them, but also illustrates an interesting point. If you send the box output through a voltage inverter, you can actually get a second trigger sequence out of this output. We'll show this in a demo patch in the next video. Here's how it sounds on a sine wave. So to show the gate outputs, I'm going to be driving everything with a Pamela's New Workout. Not trying to make it sound musical or anything like that. We just have two clock-divided clocks coming in. So you can see here we have this blue trace and then this green trace, which is 4 times as fast. These are the sounds that the clocks that we have going into ANA. The output of ANA is here in the red, and what we're seeing right now is the min output, which is behaving like a Boolean AND gate. As you can see, The outputs are only high when both inputs are high, which basically means that this slower clock is turning on and off our faster clock. What we're hearing is the Schlappy boundary controlling a tone coming from the Schlappy 3 body, and we're using that in order to hear the effect, which, as you can see, it's sort of removing notes from the clock sequence. So here we're using the mix output in order to mix gates together, and in effect this is giving us an OR gate, but mix is going to behave slightly differently in a couple of different scenarios. First of all, you can see on our trace here that as we're adding the voltage of these two clocks together, there's these little lumps that happen at the top, right? And there's another important difference, which is that if I flip this over, we're now actually subtracting this gate sequence from that one, because as you can see, this faster clock is now red, right? So if I do this just a little bit, we can kind of cross over the threshold. I actually have the output of Anna going into the slew input on boundary so that we can get a sustain period, but you can hear we're getting some more complex sort of behavior. Now I'll go ahead and compare this with the max output for you. So now we're listening to the max output, and it sounds very similar to how the mix output did when we first had it patched. But you'll notice here, those little lumps at the top are gone, mostly because the voltages are no longer adding together. We're just getting the maximum of the two. And so if we do something like this, where one of them is quieter or negative, now we're still only getting the positive clock output, because that one is set to be the maximum, right? So slightly different behavior, a lot of overlap, but they do behave differently. So ironically, the XOR output is a little bit difficult to get to behave like a traditional Boolean XOR when driving Anna with gates. And that is because it's actually expecting a bipolar input in order to behave like an XOR gate. You know, it wants signals that are going from -5 to 5 or -10 to 10. In this case, we're driving it with gates that are going from 0 to 5, and that simply isn't what it's made to work with, right? You can think of the scope shot I just showed you where we had the voltage sort of controlled clamping that's reducing the amplitude of the output. When you're sending 0 volts into one of the XOR inputs, that's clamping the entire output to be 0 volts. And within traditional XOR, when you're sending it a 0, it's actually passing through what's coming into the other input. So we're going to go ahead and actually patch these inputs, these gate inputs, into the two sum inputs, and then I'm going to add a little bit of a bipolar offset so that each channel, you can see here the green and red alternating, right, at these different speeds. And you can hear also that the behavior is such that when the slower clock is on, it's actually inverting the other clock source, right? And it might require a little bit of tweaking. It's good to know that the mag input is actually the one that is going to give you behavior that's the most similar to a traditional Boolean logic XOR, but the XOR output also does interesting things with gates, especially if you're sending it into stuff that isn't just a simple trigger input. Here I can send it, I'm sending it into the Schlappy trig input, but if I send it into the slew, it's actually going to respond to the negative voltages as well, because I have it set up to be a bipolar VCA. So, you know, there's interesting stuff that can come out of using XOR with gates. It's just don't expect it to behave exactly like a normal XOR unless you are using the processing section in order to get the voltage ranges correct. So after spending a little bit of time messing around with cut, I'm pretty sure that it basically also just gives you a normal Boolean logic XOR at its normal settings. It behaves differently than mag depending on how you have the channel control set up, and that's because you can have it show up as either of the inputs unaffected, right? So that's slightly different than how mag works, but when both knobs are facing in the positive direction, roughly 3 o'clock, it's going to give you very similar behavior to mag. So this is nice because all three of these outputs give you slightly different flavors of an XOR, right, and are better suited for driving certain drums, or maybe you want them all to trigger in unison sometimes and then split off from each other at others. I would just encourage you to see how your input processing affects all of the different logic outputs, even when you're just driving ANA with gates. So here we have the mag output, which is essentially doing a normal XOR Boolean logic sort of function, and it is doing so in a way where the output is always positive, so it'll be a lot easier to predict with a normal trigger output. So if you want your normal Boolean logic XOR, mag is the output to use. So here we have the step output, and it is another output that I'm not really sure how to describe how it behaves with gates. You can see here that it's sort of holding certain voltages. It'll hold on to gates after they hit a certain threshold. I've actually patched both of our gates into the sum inputs because usually step likes signals that cross the 0 volt boundary, and then changing the control knobs has quite a large effect on how they all behave, but I'm not entirely sure how to describe it. It's another one that probably requires some experimentation. So the swap output is another gate processor that sort of defies expectation, but one of the interesting things about it is that by changing the control knobs, you can change the behavior quite a bit. I have it patched again. Our gates are going into the sum inputs this time, and check this out. So right now we have the swap output behaving like our AND gate. If I tweak the settings a little bit, we just have input 1 going through. If I tweak them again, we just have input 2 coming through, and then if I do something, so now we're getting something similar to an OR gate. So as you can see, changing the settings of the swap outputs control knobs can actually give you a bunch of different possibilities. It's a really good output for using with voltage control or something like that to change your gate behavior. And yeah, this one's full of surprises. So here we're using box to process the gates. I think that this is going to be another one where you're going to kind of get different behaviors depending on what the actual channel knobs are doing. Here you can hear that we're getting similar behavior to the XOR input. If I do something like this, we get the output going negative sometimes. We're still getting our sort of 3-level square wave. Sometimes we're getting the positive section and sometimes we're getting the negative section. And you can see that if we were inverting this logic gate, we would actually be getting a second trigger sequence. Yeah, so I hate to say that it's like, you know, you have to experiment to feel what they are, but really the first 3 outputs are the only ones that definitely do a well-defined mathematical function to gates. The second 3 are closer to a logically defined function, but not precise because they're dealing with bipolar voltages in some instances. And the bottom 3 are just, they're wild. So I think you'll find that if you sort of patch 2 slightly more interesting trigger sources in and then turn the knobs and see what happens, you'll notice that all of the outputs will be sometimes synchronized and sometimes they'll be doing their own things, which is good for a drum beat. So yeah, hopefully that shows a little bit of what it can do with gates. Okay, I've set up another patch that's similar to our previous one to show off modulation sources. In this one, we're combining 2 modulation sources. One is an envelope on this green trace, which is coming from the Schlappy boundary, And then the second is an LFO coming from the Pamela's New Workout, which is just a simple 0 to 5 volt triangle wave LFO that's going at, I believe, a quarter of the speed of the clock. And both of these inputs are unipolar, and we're using it to drive the Schlappy 3-body and the Rabid Elephant natural gate, just going straight into the control input, not using it to ping or anything like that. This makes it so that we're able to sort of shape the overall range of the envelope coming in with the LFO. And you can hear that as the LFO starts to increase, we're sort of swelling with the with this envelope going through a bit more. And that's because when the envelope goes into lower voltages, the minimum of the two is going to be that low voltage, right? So it's sort of behaving like an AND gate, like clamping or choking the other inputs, right? I also have it plugged into the 3-body's phase modulation index. And basically what that does is it makes it so that one of the other oscillators on the 3-body starts to phase modulate the main oscillator. And the reason I did it like this is because I feel like the min output lends itself to modulating parameters that want to sit around a low value and then kind of peak up every once in a while, right? So you can hear that as the envelope is kicking in more and opening up the filter, we're also adding more of the phase modulation sound. I'll go ahead and take that out. Now we just have a normal sawtooth going through a low pass filter, right? As I increase the overall phase index, you can hear that it starts to get a little bit raspier as it's opening up, but then slowly decays into that simple sawtooth again. Something else I like to do with modulation is I'll take one of the inputs, I'll patch it into the main input, I'll take the other one, I'll patch it into the sum. And I feel like this gives me a lot more ways to actually alter the way that the modulation sources are affecting each other. For example, I can take this one up and I can make this one now go negative, right? Actually, on min, that's not going to be very interesting, but you'll see. I'll try it out with a couple other outputs and we'll get a better idea of how this function can work. Okay, so now I have the mix output patched up, and I'm going to show you how to use this as an attenuvert offset. Basically, we have our boundaries envelope plugged into the main input on channel 1 and nothing plugged into channel 2. And as you can see, I can use the channel 1 control knob in order to either invert the signal, you can see now it's coming out as red, or to reduce the level of the positive signal. Here we have increasing the level of the positive signal and then reducing it. And then we can also change where the signal sort of zeroes out, right? So now we're adding to the floor of where the signal is going to go, and now we're making it so the signal is going to go slightly negative when it's at its lower values, right? We can also do something like do this and then invert it. And now we're getting a sort of ducking effect instead of the normal envelope effect from the same envelope. And then, of course, we can add in our second modulation source. I'm just going to plug this into the sum input over here, but you can plug it into either sum input. It'll behave the same way. And now we have our LFO that's being added into the mix. Okay, so we have another patch set up here in order to show you using max with modulation. And as you can see from our scope, we have these little spikes that are sort of being added to our overall LFO. And this works sort of in the opposite way that min works, which is that min will lower the ceiling for outgoing control voltage range, and max will raise the floor, right? So if either input goes high, then the output will go high. As you can hear, if I turn off the envelope coming in, then the LFO just goes out unaffected, right? Whereas with min, if you turn off either input, because the minimum of both of the inputs will be 0, it just turns off the entire output, at least when you're using it with unipolar control voltages. So as you can hear, we get this nice way to sort of like add together these two modulation sources in a way that doesn't really change their overall range too much. I can control how much of the swell I want to hear. Now the swell is really present. Now it's just sort of in the background a little bit. And destinations or inputs on your other modules that want to sit at a high value and then only dip down every once in a while. So like if you have an envelope or something like that you want to be open most of the time, but every once in a while give you a pluckier note, that's a good place to do it. I'm here going to plug it into my IDUM's chance input, which is driving the boundaries trigger input. And you can hear now we're starting to get ratchets most of the time, but every once in a while the ratchets turn off. That's because when the LFO is going to its lower settings or the envelopes are at its lower settings, the chance input is at 0, but most of the time we're getting a ratchet here. So that's using max for modulation. So here we have another example of using modulation, this time using the XOR output. And I actually changed to another LFO source. I'm using the mutable tides as a bipolar tempo synced LFO, simply because XOR really likes to get in bipolar voltages instead of only using a unipolar voltage. When, as I pointed out earlier, when using XOR, the top and bottom of the wave get clipped by a level set by one of the modulation inputs or one of Anna's inputs. And so if one of our voltages is sitting at 0 a lot of the time, that's going to make it so that it only really has an output when both signals are going high. So in this case, this shows how we can use our LFO in this case to sort of change the voltage polarity of our envelope input, which is also coming in. And that makes XOR particularly good at driving signals or modulation inputs that want to sit at a center value and then deviate in either direction every once in a while. So in this case, I'm using it to control the panning on 3D VCA. You can hear we're normally sitting right about in the middle, but then sometimes when the envelope picks up, then our sound either deviates to the left or right for that little while that the envelope is active, right? So this gives us an interesting way to modulate these sorts of parameters that really like to have a bipolar voltage coming in, and also a way to get interesting shapes out of multiple ranges of modulation inputs. So here I have the cut output processing modulation. We have the same bipolar LFO coming in as well as the unipolar envelope from boundary. And, you know, as you can hear, it's doing some weird stuff. I actually, just for fun, ran cut into the multiply input for the modulation oscillator on the Schlappy 3 body, so you can hear it sort of selecting all of the different overtones that it can do and phase modulating the main oscillator. And I can illustrate here. If I turn this input off, we get something that is more or less the same as our envelope input. If I turn off the envelope input and then I turn this on, we get something that is more or less the same as our normal LFO. You can hear there's a little bit of a kink, but that might just be because I can't really see the LED indicator on the other side. So this is a good way to replicate either input, right? And like I said before, this is one of the outputs that can really easily switch between both inputs, especially if you're using it in conjunction with the multiply inputs. But when you get both coming in, you get these weird mangled combinations of the two. And sadly, I can't really explain it much better than that. You're just going to have to experiment with cut and see what it gives you. But I think that cut does a really good job of messing with modulation signals. So here I'm using the mag output for processing modulation, and one of the best parts about the mag output is that no matter what you throw in, the output is always positive and that it reacts to changes with either input. So mag is good for having something really dynamic and interesting going on. It's going to always be doing something when you're sending stuff in, and you can see here I'm setting in this bipolar LFO and the unipolar envelope, and our output is sitting at a positive value almost all the time. So if I even invert one of these inputs, you can see we're still sitting in a positive range. I can invert even the envelope coming in, which is always positive. So now we're sending in a negative envelope and the output is still positive. So this is a really good output for modulating. Right now I'm doing like the filter cutoff, a VCA amount for voice. I'm also using it to change the phase modulation index, but it can be good for something like a wavetable oscillators wave index as well, so that as the filter is opening up, it's also allowing through a brighter oscillator tone, something like that. So mag is super useful for modulation purposes. So here we are using the step output for processing modulation, and just for fun, I ended up running this output into the volt per octave on the 3-body as well. I'm not quantizing it or anything, but I think it illustrates the sort of crazy R2D2 kind of sounds you can get out of this. A lot of really bizarre pseudo-random behavior, and I think that you can hear that even though we're not really changing what the modulation inputs are doing, we're getting a pretty wide variety of behavior, even if it sort of follows a similar pattern. Something I like to keep in mind with this output is that the most interesting things about it happen when your inputs are crossing the 0 volt boundary, and that's because that's when it sort of decides to either start sampling one of the inputs or hold both inputs, or start sampling the other input. When both of your inputs are crossing 0 volts, that leads to a lot more complex behavior. So instead of running the envelope into our main input and using it as a unipolar input, I'm running it into the sum and then adding a little bit of a negative offset, so you can see this input is now also negative. Sometimes if I run it into the unipolar, you can hear it becomes a little bit less interesting, although there is still stuff going on, and that's partially because this input is going across the 0 volt threshold. But once I cross into that other range, you can hear it gets a lot more complex. So this output is great for running into oscillators. One of the really fun things you can do with it also is to feedback it into one of the sources that's driving it. So I'm going to go ahead and take this LFO out of the clock. Now it's a free running LFO, and I'm taking it out of the filter input from the natural gate, just opening that filter up, and now I'm going to run it into the frequency modulation input. And if I do something like this, you can start to see the LFO changing its shape depending on what's going on with the step output. So this will lead to a lot more of the less predictable pseudo-random sort of behavior. This is similar to what the smooth step generator is doing, feedbacking a track and hold with the oscillator that is driving the track and hold. So you can get a lot of really interesting, unpredictable behavior out of this output if you are creative about ways to patch it, if you use it for feedback, and if you find sources that really like to drive it. I particularly like the Schlappy 3-boundary here. The mutable tides is great because it has 4 outputs, so you can be running things into all 4 of Anna's, or into 4 of Anna's 6 inputs. I'll definitely be going over this in the demo patch video. So I'm using the swap output for modulation now, and swap is another one of those outputs that's able to sort of perfectly recreate either input. I use it a lot for swapping between different tempo synced LFOs. So in this example, I've unpatched the boundary and I have it patched into 2 of the outputs of tides that are frequency multiples of each other. And as you can hear, we're sort of getting either one LFO or the other coming out, with it sometimes turning off. And this is similar to XOR, great for modulating a value where you want it to sit at even a specific value sometimes, right? Because when the swap switches are off, there it's sitting at the exact value that you tuned it to, and then it deviates in both directions every once in a while. So I use this a lot for controlling the delay time on certain modules. I use it with beads a lot for the timing control because it can sort of sit at a specific time value and then deviate every once in a while. It's also good for the phase modulation index or panning. I can plug it into the panning just to give you an example of sitting at that center value. You can hear that we're mostly in the middle, but every once in a while it's going left or right. And I'm running one of these into the sum input and the other into the multiply input so that I can get a little bit more interesting of a way to actually alter the two. Change it into a triangle. And run them both into the sum inputs. All right, so here you can see we're mostly grabbing that first LFO. Now we're mostly grabbing that second LFO, right? And then we're able to kind of do something in the middle right here. So yeah, swap, interesting output for modulation. Really, you want to use it for certain things where it doesn't mind jumping to 0 sometimes, right? Certain modulation doesn't like those sorts of sharp jumps. Swap is really great for that for this specific sort of shape, as you can see, where it just jumps between one thing and another. So here we have the box output, which is being driven by our tides and our boundary again. And the box output is what's creating this trigger sequence that I'm sending into the natural gate instead of driving the filter cutoff frequency directly. Instead, I'm going into the hit. So we're sending triggers out from box into the hit input on the natural gate. And you can see on our scope, we're getting these sort of trigger sequences. If I change the range, you'll start to see we're getting the negative triggers as well. And you can hear that it sort of shuts off the envelope that's happening on the natural gate. That's because we're also driving the decay parameter with box. So that makes it so that when we're sending it a positive gate, it's opening up the gate, the envelope even more. And when we're sending a negative gate, it actually shortens the envelope time. So it sort of cuts off whatever's already happening there. So if I change some of these settings, you can see that we're going to get different sorts of trigger sequences out of everything. Box particularly likes to have you change the sort of range of the inputs in order to change the overall behavior, right? And I'm going to show you something I really like to do with box really quick. We're going to take this out. I'm going to go ahead and plug it into the trigger input on the tides. We're still tempo syncing the tides, right? But we're re-triggering tides early whenever there's a box. And if I mess with the parameters, this is another case where we're getting sort of more interesting feedback behavior. You can see it's sort of giving us a little bit of a bouncing ball kind of thing. If I try and change some of the other values, you can see we're sometimes getting this triangle wave and sometimes getting a little bit that little tiny sawtooth, but it's triggering a gate every time either way, right? So, oh, there we go. Let me try and open this up a little bit more. So this is an interesting way to get a sort of less predictable behavior out of box. Now I'm going to go ahead and take out the clock sync input on tides. So now we just have a free running LFO that's doing this. You can hear that it's freaking out in a really nice way, and it's partially maintaining the tempo sync because the trigger, the envelope that we have coming in is being triggered by our main sequencer, right? I change the envelope shape, we'll also be getting different behavior out of this feedback loop. That's something I really like doing with Anna, is having modulation feedback. A lot of people use audio for feedback, but personally, I think modulation feedback and sequencer feedback is really interesting. I'll definitely have some examples of that in the more thorough patch example video coming out after this. And yeah, I think that Box, it's great for just giving you a gate no matter what's going on with Anna. It obviously doesn't lend itself equally to modulating every single thing that you have going on. You're not going to get note sequences out of it or anything like that. For driving a filter directly, it might not be super interesting, but the fact that it has 3 levels instead of just a normal square wave makes it so that, sort of similarly with the swap and the XOR, it can sit at a 0 volt value and then just go in each direction for a little while, so you can hear I'm modulating the natural gate decay, and it's making it so that we get both really long, sort of long, and really short envelopes out of it, right? So Box is a great output for messing with modulation, and some experimentation with it goes a long way. Okay, so here we have a very similar patch to the previous patches. We've gone over using Anna for gates. We've gone over using Anna for modulation. Now we're going to show it with note sequences. And we're going to go through the outputs one by one. Here we have 2 note sequences that are going into Anna. They're coming from my Westlicht performer, and I have them set up to be kind of different kinds of sequences. So if you look here, I put the quantizer right next to Anna so that we could see the notes changing in multiple ways. The first 2 inputs are our input sequences, and those are just getting semitone quantized so that we can see what's going on here. You can see one of our sequences is only changing once every 4 steps. The second sequence is changing almost every step. There's a couple that maybe stay put. And then the third input is our actual output coming from Anna. So that shows you what Anna is doing here. Sadly, I can't get these to show up any larger. The actual oscilloscope isn't a good way to look at note sequences. But you can see our first and second sequences coming in here, and then this is what's happening at the output. I think honestly, looking at the ornament and crimes is going to be an easier way to tell what's going on. And so now we're going to look at how the min output processes sequences, and in order to do so, I'm going to go ahead and unplug one of these. Now we have just the 16 note sequence coming in, right? And you can hear there's different stuff happening on each note. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lower this second static voltage, right? There's nothing patched into input 1, so this is just a static control. And as I lower it, you can hear the higher notes start to get reduced in range, right? But we're actually not altering the rest of the sequence. We're just changing the upper limit of what the sequence can do, right? Right, so you can hear that one note. That's now the highest note that's allowed to go through in the sequence. I can raise that, and a lot more of the complexity comes back in, or I can set it all the way up, and then it's not affecting anything at all. Now, there's actually a second way that we can do this, and that's by using the attenuator. But when I use the attenuator, it sort of pinches the entire note range down instead of just chopping off the top, right? So if I do something like this, you can hear that the note range has been reduced, but all of the notes are different now, right? For min, I'm now just chopping off the upper range of the sequence without affecting the lower notes, right? So this gives us actually a pretty useful musical way in order to change note sequences going through Anna. I'm going to go ahead and plug in our slower sequence into the first input, and you can hear that we're now doing this essentially under voltage control, right? The second sequence is now the one that's determining the upper limit of the faster sequence, and so that gives us a way to sort of clip our sequence using another voltage. And now we'll go ahead and take a look at the other outputs and how they work with voltage sequences. Okay, so now we're using the mix output for processing note sequences, and I don't think it should come as a surprise that this is just a way to sort of like offset our note sequence and transpose it, right? So we have things going in to the quantizer, so everything's going to stay in tune. Our faster sequence is going in here, and I'm just going to go ahead and shift it up. You can hear that the overall shape of the sequence is the same, but we're just accessing a different range of the keyboard, so to speak. So shifting it down, getting these nice bassy tones, shifting it up, getting more of a lead, plucky sort of sound. And of course, that's useful in and of itself, but the real interesting thing happens when you use a second sequencer to transpose it. So I actually slowed down our first sequencer, the slower one, so that it only changes every 32 steps, right? So I'm going to go ahead and plug this in here. And you can hear that every 2 measures, the entire sequence will shift in range. And that's because our secondary note sequencer, the slower one, is changing its value every 2 measures, and then that lets us shift the faster sequence around automatically. So this can be a really powerful tool, despite its simplicity, for altering note sequences in a sort of predictable way. Another nice thing about it is that you actually still have these 2 other sum inputs, so you can use those in order to further transpose the result and mix a bunch of different sequencers together. So here we're using the max output in order to process our note sequences, and no surprises here. Max does the opposite of min, whereas min limited the upper notes of our sequence down, max will limit the lower notes of our sequence up. So as I change this static voltage, you can hear there's a sort of note that it will stop at, and it won't be able to go further below that, right? The one, dun, dun, that one, that's the lowest note in our sequence now, right? And it's doing so in a way that doesn't alter the upper notes in the sequence. Whereas if we were to shift everything up or use the attenuate offset in order to do a similar effect, it would change all of the notes. This just lets us use a voltage in order to set the lowest note in the sequence, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and add back in our slower sequence. It's back to being a 16-step sequence where the note changes once every 4 steps, right? So you can hear it sort of automating this process, right? And if I make that really big and the overall range of that slower sequence goes really high, then it'll sort of force the other sequence to just go to that higher note. So yeah, max, opposite of min, limits the lower notes of the sequence. Min lowers the higher notes of the sequence. So now we're using the XOR output in order to process our voltage sequences, and what this output is going to do is reduce the overall range of the sequence, and it's going to do that centered around 0. So in my opinion, it's best to use this with shift inputs or with a voltage sequence that already has a negative portion of the wave, just so that when it gets flipped over, it's going to do something interesting, right? So you can see here, I've patched our faster sequence into the shift input, and you can see it gets red every once in a while. I can even do that a little bit more, right? And then as I change this knob, we're going to hear the overall range of the sequence reduced, right? But the cool thing is that when I flip this over, it actually inverts that sequence, right? So now we're listening to the sequence actually flipped over from the shape that it was making before. I'll go ahead and shift that up a little bit, which in this case means I have to turn the knob down. But yeah, you're gonna get the most interesting results when you're doing stuff that is both positive and negative, meaning the lights turn both green and red. So go ahead and go through that range again. You can here. Now the overall sequence has been sort of squished towards the middle, but the notes that are in the middle of that sequence are unaffected, right? Until I cross over 0, then they get flipped over again, right? I'm going to go ahead and plug in our slower sequence into the shift input here. So you're getting something weird out of it, you know, some voltage controlled reversal of the sequence, clipping of the overall range, and just multiplying two sequences together. That's what you're listening to, basically. So here we're using the cut output to process note sequences. Again, it's really hard to describe what's going on here. It's just going to give you a sort of cross-modulated mishmash of both inputs. I will say that, like using it for other purposes, if you zero out one of the inputs, it should pass the other input, the not zeroed out input along, right? So right now we're listening mostly to the slower input in channel 1 going, and now if I zero this out, we're mostly listening to the faster sequence coming in. So you're just going to have to experiment with this one. It does do some pretty interesting stuff. Cool thing about it is, you know, flipping it backwards still kind of gives you a lot of positive voltages. Maybe not for both of them at the same time, but one of them being positive and one of them being negative does do some interesting stuff. So you're going to have to experiment and get us an intuitive feel for it. I don't know exactly how to describe what it does for note sequences. So now we're using the mag output in order to process our voltage sequences, and again, one of the nice things about this output is that it's always positive, meaning that you're going to always get something usable. You set your lowest note on your oscillator, you're only going to be moving upwards from there. One of the other interesting things about it is that it responds to both inputs changing, right? So no matter what, if one of your sequence changes, the output sequence to this changes. But something to note is that because these knobs are both at roughly the same value, the difference between the two sequences is pretty minimal. So if you want to get a larger range of outputs from mag, it actually helps to have one of them be going in the negative direction and one of them be going in the positive direction. That leads to a larger difference between the values of the sequences and, in my opinion, more interesting results out of mag. Now we're looking at the step output. Step is interesting in that it can be used as a sample and hold with the note sequences, and you can use it to sort of like pick out certain notes in a sequence and stuff like that, but I would say that driving it with two inputs is going to give you the most useful results. And if you put in like a note sequence and a gate, keep in mind that the gate is going to transpose that note sequence because the two are now added together. So slightly different than before. I still think it's more useful this way. And again, I suggest using step with the sum inputs if you are using it for unipolar voltages like a normal note sequencer is, simply because having it cross the 0 volt threshold is where the clocking of the track and hold happens. So I'm going to go ahead and you can hear yet another sort of mishmash of the two sequences coming in. It's nice because it will sort of like turn off one of the sequences while the other one is going on. It also might not repeat itself quite as consistently as the other sequences, but with a sort of predictable input, you can usually sort of get used to what the behavior of the output is going to be. So here we have our swap output doing the voltage sequence processing of our two sequences. Again, I have them patched into the shift inputs, and something to note about the swap output is that it has its most notable setting is when both switches are off, right? So you can hear we have that one note that's sort of the focal point of this sequence. That's our oscillator bass note, 0 volts, right? And one of the cool things about this is it lets us, first of all, it's always going to give you a really simple sequence, right? So if I'm shifting things really far in both directions, we're still able to hear that one note coming out, right? Even though there's some pretty significant behavior happening in both directions. The other thing is that you know, I like using this output a lot for note sequence transposition, right? So off screen, I have a leaves expander. I'm going to go ahead and unplug this and just turn up some of the sliders on my leaves expander. So we have just a boring old 8-step sequence. When I plug Anna back into the transpose input, you can hear we have that main sort of motif, the 8-step sequence, but if I change the settings on Anna, it changes which sections of that 8-step sequence we're actually modifying now, right? While still, for the most part, staying in the off position so that we're able to alter only certain portions of the sequence. So here we are using the box output to process note sequences, and it doesn't sound very good. This is not going to be your go-to for using for note sequencing. However, one thing that we are able to do with the box output when using it with note sequences is extract triggers from the relative behavior of the two inputs. So I have a drum machine. It's the VPME quad drum off screen. I love this drum machine. It's super, super useful. And what I'm doing is I'm using the note sequences that are coming in to generate triggers. And I'm doing that using the sort of technique that I mentioned before, where you invert the box output, you get a second drum trigger because you get both the positive and negative gates. And as you can hear, we're getting a, you know, serviceable drum beat out of it for free. And if I change these notes, or these knobs rather, it changes the drum pattern, and it's all completely determined by our note sequences. So this is another version of the previous patch. Here we're going to be showing how to use Anna with audio, and as our audio source we have the mutable tides. I'm using the boundary again as a VCA and envelope, and also using the boundaries envelope output to modulate the tides smoothness parameter so that we can get a little bit of a little filter sweep, right? Leaves and tree are doing the sequencing going through. Ornaments and crimes is the quantizer. And then here we have our unaltered signal being the green trace, and the yellow trace is our altered signal. We're looking at the min output, and as I reduce the static voltage on channel 2, you can see that we're sort of chopping off the top of this wave. It's distorting the signal while simultaneously lowering its amplitude. And if I do that a little bit more, you can hear we only get the like really crisp little tips of that signal coming through when it's at its highest amplitude. So we've distorted and reduced the amplitude even more, and now if I go down here, the signal is completely silent. But if you look at the scope, you can see there's still a DC offset. And it's important to note that most audio circuits can handle that, but some of them don't like to have DC sent in. They might behave sort of strangely. So if you're noticing any of the outputs on Anna cause another audio effect or something of that sort to behave strangely, I suggest running it through a high-pass filter before going into your other audio effect. So now we have a drum machine coming through. This is again from our quad drum, just playing a normal break. And basically when we start to reduce the static voltage over here, you can hear it starting to clip off. You can see it starting to clip off the top, but you can hear it reducing the overall level and also adding some distortion. As I keep going lower, you can hear only really the louder sounds will come through. So it's almost acting like a gate, right? And then down to mostly silent. Something else that I wanted to show was using a second oscillator in order to modulate the Anna 2, so we get a sort of ring modulation sort of sound. So here, just a normal sine wave coming from the Schlappy 3 body. And I'm running it into the main input 2. I'm going to go ahead and change that frequency. You can hear some ring modulation sorts of sounds happen. And, I'll go ahead and show this on the drum machine as well. So bunch of different examples of using the mix output, but just, for these purposes, you can see we're using the mix in order to mix together our tides and drum machine. I can invert the phase of one of them and control the overall levels. This is done with like a little bit of boost. So yeah, mix, super useful for mixing these things together. So here we're using the max output. It's very similar to the min output with an important distinction. When max is passing through audio unaffected, min is only passing a DC voltage and vice versa. So you can see as I start to clip off the bottom of the wave, we get the distortion and then the lowered volume, and then we suddenly are left with just a DC voltage. If we go ahead and look at the min output, now it's passing unaffected audio, right? Then if I go ahead, clip this down, now this is just passing a DC voltage. We go back to max. Max is passing through unaffected audio. So this can be used as a sort of glitchy panner that I'll go ahead and show next. Okay, so here I have both the min and max patched into the left and right channels of my 3D VCA. You should be hearing it in stereo, and you can hear that as I move the knob to the left, we hear things more in one ear. If I move them to the right, we hear them more in the other ear. In the middle, we get a sort of distorted version of both. I'm going to go ahead and run in an LFO. And now we're getting voltage controlled panning using Anna. So here we're listening to the XOR output, and you can see on the scope we're not really doing anything to the signal right now. In order to have the input and output of XOR be in phase, the second channel needs to be negative because we're not flipping the signal over like an XOR. And I'll just go ahead and show you that effect. You can see now we're starting to clip off the top and bottom. We're getting a nice kind of beefy distortion out of it, but the amplitude is quieter, right? And then the most intense distortion happens when the signal is at its quietest. And we can actually get pretty quiet on this version of it, but then we go in the other direction, and now the signal's been inverted, but again, it distorts as it gets close to that 0 point, right? So one of the cool things about this is that we can actually amplify our signal while simultaneously reducing the overall voltage range of it. That's called soft clipping. And one of the best parts about this is it's really good for feedback patching, especially when you want to invert the amplitude of your signal. I'll go ahead and show this to you on some drums. You can hear we're getting more distortion when the VCA is quieter and getting an unaffected signal with the polarity inverted. So I know that I mentioned this before, but this is my favorite output to use for traditional ring modulation sorts of sounds. So we go ahead and listen to changing the oscillator frequency. You can hear it sounds quite nice. And just to sort of give you an example of the difference, I'm going to go ahead and unplug this. Now our signal's unaffected. I'm going to plug into the multiply instead. It still sounds nice, but do you hear how the XOR is a little bit warmer, I guess, for lack of a better word? As it distorts as it's closing, it sort of adds a little bit more grit to it. I'm going to go ahead and show you the comparison for that again. You hear the difference there? I like it a lot. It's subtle, but it gives you some really nice ring modulation kind of tones. Let's go ahead and do it with the drums again. Okay, here is the cut output being used for audio. You can see in the actual scope that we're getting a little bit of that kink in the middle, and that's adding some nice overtones to our signal without really warping it out too crazy. But then you can also get this nice nasty distortion as well. You can invert your signal. And just kind of add a little bit of wrapping in that area. Let me turn that down a tiny bit. Yeah, cut does all kinds of nice stuff to audio, especially if your signals are kind of on the simpler oscillator sort of side. It can add some really nice raspy overtones in this area. Go ahead and show it to you with drums. Here we're getting some wave folding, some extra harmonics being added, and then that kick drum really coming through with the distortion. Really nice kind of tearing sound from the wave folding. I'm going to go ahead and plug in this oscillator. We'll do it with the synth voice first. You can hear if we zero out the oscillator, it more or less goes to that one input. We can have it come back in. Gonna make it into an LFO. You can see where this thing really shines. All right, now drum machine time. So here we're looking at the mag output for processing audio, and as you can see, we have a sort of doubling up effect happening to our waveform. It's not quite the octave up effect that I normally like to go for here, but I think you can get some really interesting results by sort of like leaning the sawtooth in one direction or another. You can see that we can reverse the direction of the sawtooth, and again, everything is positive here. We get some nice overtones where the wave reverses direction. If I show it to you with the more of a sine wave or triangle wave sort of input, you can see here that our output is actually twice the frequency of the input, but because we're taking the negative portion of the wave and we're flipping it to the top, right? So if you listen, it's roughly an octave lower. This is roughly an octave higher, and it comes with some distortion that's due to the nature of the effect, but it still is mathematically an octave higher, right? So now I'm going to go ahead and run in an LFO, right? I'll go ahead and turn it on the scope just to show you the wave animation sort of effect. Maybe turn this down. Maybe turn the speed down too. All right, there we go. So you can hear the wave sounds like it's moving a little bit more between the higher and lower harmonics that are present in this signal, right? I'm going to go ahead and go back to the sawtooth. It's going to be really cool for kind of alternating the direction of the sawtooth under voltage control. And yeah, let's go ahead and listen to that at audio rate. Again, this is an output where changes in either input are going to be coming through to the output, so you will hear both signals present in the output signal chain. I'm going to go ahead and this while we take a look at what it does with our drum machine. The effect is most engaged when you are roughly in the middle, because then the most sort of reversed waveform peaks are going to be happening. Don't worry if you didn't understand that. Basically, if you want the distortion and the octave up effect to happen, put this knob in the middle, right? If you go in this direction, it'll sort of lift the output signal away from that 0 point where it's going to be reflecting the waves. If I go back here, you can hear it's giving us kind of a squelchier, kind of tearing sound when the snare hits, right? Go this way. Back to our more or less normal signal. You can see it's shifted upwards with the DC voltage, but if your audio output has the high pass filtering that we were talking about, that you won't be able to hear that really, right? All you really hear is when it's in the middle and it's having its harmonics doubled, right? Let's go ahead and plug that oscillator back in. I'll put it back on the scope. Turn the volume up. I think you'll notice that a lot of the outputs, especially in this row, give you sort of ring modulator sorts of sounds on Anna. That's to be expected with the cross modulation circuitry. When you're running into audio sources, you're going to kind of get that like characteristic bell sound whenever they're clashing against each other. So now we're listening to the step output. I'm gonna be honest, with one input, it's not very interesting. I'll just go ahead and show you what it looks like. You can see it's kind of clipping the top, and then as we go across 0, it gives us this little window and then shifts up. It's not going to do very much, right? What you want is for a second oscillator to be in there. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on our static oscillator, right? Plug it into the second input. This is where all the magic happens. In fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to plug it into the sum input, just because I've found that that gives us a lot more control over the amount of the effect, right? You can hear we're getting sort of downsampling type effects, but not exactly. But we're definitely getting more grit than we were in the previous outputs that we looked at. Let's go ahead and switch this to our drum machine. Definitely getting some nasty sample and hold grit right there. Yeah, this is an output that can give you really interesting results, but you gotta really think about what you're doing at the inputs. I'll go ahead and switch this to the main input just to demonstrate the difference. You can hear if this output is quiet, it's still affecting the sampling behavior, right? Even when it's super, super quiet, we're getting something out of that. But when it's louder, it gets added into the final signal more. Just for kicks, I'm going to go ahead and unplug this, and I'm going to plug in our Tides monosynth. I think this is going to be a sort of more musical range that you might actually go for. It's like not just a static oscillator, but an oscillator that is in tune with the rest of your music going in to modulate another piece that's actually musically related to it, right? Having overtones in the clocking signal can change the behavior quite a bit. I'm actually going to plug this into the sum input. I think that's a little bit more interesting than just the straight up oscillator. What's what's that? Is that my favorite output I hear? It is. It's swap. And man, this thing is killer for distortion. I've gotten all kinds of nasty tones out of it. It adds a bunch of really fantastic overtones. And, you know, even just with a static voltage, you can see here the static voltage that we have in channel 2 is the little box that's happening at the bottom. But if we go around here, it's just like so much squelchier than the box output, even though they are very similar in behavior. Like, just the fact that it's not constantly the same volume, and like, listen to that. It gives you so much good stuff out of it, right? I think you all know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna plug in the other oscillator. So let's go ahead and turn on that oscillator. I'm gonna patch it into the sum input. Ooh. Let's do it as an LFO for a little bit. Yeah, just the weird, like, phasey nastiness. This is usually the output that I start with when I'm going for distortion on Anna, and I'll definitely dive into that in the next demo video. But audio rate. You can hear, even with the ring modulation sorts of sounds, that the volume of the second of the main input is actually affecting the overall volume quite a bit. It's unlike some of the other outputs where any signal on, you know, the sort of carrier oscillator giving you the ring modulation sort of effect is just going to bleed through to the output. This one, obviously, you need to set it into the right position, but you can have it sort of reflect the behavior of its input a lot more nicely. Alright, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna take this one out just to show you the drums. Yeah, you can hear those drums get nasty right away, right? Even just like, there's so many sweet spots on this thing for distortion. You can hear we're just, listen to this snare through here. I'll get people to dance at 6 a.m. So, yeah, let's plug in the oscillator again. You know what? I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to plug tides into that input so we can just hear what the combination sounds like. Ooh, that gets weird. Here, it kind of comes through more cleanly over there. Let's turn the drums down a tiny bit even. Yeah, so lots of interesting stuff to be had out of swap. It's one of my favorite outputs on this whole thing, especially you want distortion. It gives you a lot more versatility than the other outputs do for that purpose. Okay, what you're listening to now is Box being used as a distortion comparator, pulse width modulator sort of thing. You can see here we have our tides oscillator coming in, and we have some of these nice little squelchy square wave spikes happening. If I change this threshold, you get a much more thorough kind of meaty square wave, and changing this threshold will change the amount of pulse width modulation either to the top or the bottom or both, and then also flip the direction of the wave, right? So you can see here it's out of phase with the wave, here it's in phase with the wave, and we can of course use the attenuverter to also influence that. You get a lot of really nice sounds when this second controller, when either of the inputs are close to 0, right? You get that nice, that sweet spot where everything gets really squelchy, right? I'm going to go ahead and run in our oscillator. I'm sure everyone's tired of hearing it, but you know, it's thorough. And I'm going to run it into the sum input, right? I think it's the most interesting when it's kind of right at the edge of audibility. Like, it's having an effect, but it's not quite as strong as right here where it's sort of taking over the effect. Like here, you can't even hear that second oscillator at all. If I just kind of tweak this until we're right at that threshold, then it adds a little bit of raspiness, you know? I will say too, this input benefits quite a bit from using the multiply inputs, right? And I'm gonna go ahead and show that. I feel like you can get a sort of pseudo phase modulation out of it. I think it's because it's always keeping everything at the same volume. And I'll go ahead and do it as an LFO so you can see what I'm talking about, right? So it sort of shifts the level of where it starts to do the comparator effect. And it makes the lobes kind of move backwards and forwards, right? And because it's always giving you something, any tiny bit of audio at either of the inputs is going to give you an effect. It gives a nice kind of weird phasing sort of effect. I don't know if it's audible or not, but I've gotten it to do that before. Let's go ahead and show this with the drums, all right? I'm going to unplug the oscillator, go to drums. Think something like this might give you all a pretty good idea of what Box can do with drums. Box is cool because it sort of it acts like a compressor, right? Everything has to be at the same volume because it's all just a square wave that only has 3 levels, right? So you can hear that if I make the bass drum less prominent, suddenly the hi-hat and snare take up that room, right? I'm gonna go ahead and make the snare really tiny. Basically, anything that's coming through is going to be forced to be the same volume, right? And when multiple things are fighting for that space, they kind of crunch together. So yeah, Box definitely does some nice things for drums. And again, just for the sake of thoroughness, we're gonna go ahead and plug in that oscillator. I'll plug it into the plus input again. And right now it's an LFO, so you can kind of hear the phasing effect. Or rather, this would be more like the pulse width modulation effect. And then I'll do it at audio rate. If I, again, put it to that threshold spot I talked about earlier, you will only really hear the oscillator coming in when there's other stuff going on. Yeah, so Box, super useful for distortion, super useful for drums and for fattening up synths. I will say that because of the compression effect, if you're using it to get pulse width modulation on a waveform or something like that, I would suggest running it into a filter, a VCA, some other way of reducing the volume after you've run it into Box rather than before, because running stuff to alter the volume of your synths before Box, it's just all going to turn into a garbled mess like what you hear right now. So as you can see, there are a boatload of things that we can do with Anna. So many things, in fact, that I'm splitting my normal video demo into 2 parts. In the follow-up video, we'll be going over some demo patches and other ideas to get you started on your journey of getting the most out of Anna. We'll be showing a few modules that you may want to keep close to your Anna, as well as possible uses for running multiple Annas in your system. I'm going to go ahead and leave you with a few thoughts about how I use Anna the most often. Usually what I do is I like to explore the possibilities of my patch without having a direct idea of exactly what I'm doing. What this means is basically instead of thinking about how you want to alter your patch, like it's time to sweep the filter, I'm going to go ahead and increase the FM. Anna lets you patch into a bunch of different parameters and then change them all together with just its 2 control knobs. This lets you step away from intentionally tweaking one knob at a time and leads you to surprises. Now you're changing one of the knobs and saying, I wonder what this is going to do. Then you might find a sweet spot and keep developing your patch from there. The way that I usually do this is I set up and lay out a skeleton for my patch that I like. So let's go ahead and hear what I have so far. I have the VPME quad drum. It's being affected by IDUM, but we're currently have that off. And of course, I haven't replaced the sliders and LEDs on IDUM, but look at this beautiful panel. The replacement panels by... I'm spacing. I'll go ahead and link to the replacement panels for IDUM in this, but man, they look good. So we have our drum, and then I have this pad coming from Tides going into 3D VCA so I can scan through all the different pairs of notes and isolate different notes in the chord. And finally we have, you guessed it, 3-body going through the natural gate. I really love this combination, and what I'm doing here is I'm using both channels of the natural gate but with different oscillators, and then I'm triggering them sort of slightly differently in order to create more of a stereo effect, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of walk you through my thought process for picking which outputs to use to modulate which parameters, and then show it in the context of the entire patch. So let's go ahead and start out with this pad. The first thing that I would like is for it to not be on all the time, right? And so I'm going to want to modulate the Z parameter so that we're changing the overall level of the pad. So I'm going to go ahead and take the magnitude output, because mag likes to be plugged into things that only move in one direction, and Z is something that once we set it to its minimum value and then we turn the knobs in either direction, it's only going to be increasing the Z amount, right? So now we're going to have to go ahead and think of what we would like to modulate our X and Y. And for this, I think what I would like to do is to mult my min and max, and so that I can patch it into other stuff in the system, because these two outputs are quite useful. I'm going to go ahead and just, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to patch min and max into X and Y, right? And that it's going to make it so that certain notes in the chord are more kind of present, but that every once in a while the other notes will come through as well, right? So I'm going to go ahead and do it like this. And now you can hear that we're also changing the panning, because I have different notes going into different points on 3D VCA, and we're using both outputs in stereo, but you can hear this is changing things quite a bit, right? We're also having this chord going through beads, and I think I would like to have a couple different ways to shape what's going on with beads. So first of all, one of my favorite things to do is to take the box output and run it into freeze on beads. And so if we kind of get it to one of these points, you can hear that even when I change the input, let's maybe turn the wet dry down a little bit. And of course we need a little bit of reverb, you know? Even when I change the input, oh, we're actually holding on to the previous chord, right? So I guess that's another thing that might be interesting to modulate, is the shift input. So let's go ahead and get it to a point where we're hearing our main input, right? And let's take shift. I'm only going to use one more output for this. Let's use the swap, because with a chord, right, we want to have, I picked out this one chord that I liked. And of course now I can't really hear it. It was, let's make sure that we hear all four. This one. I really like this chord, and it's the shift level. It's not a continuous control. It kind of like has a certain number of selections, and once you cross a threshold, it will swap really quickly to another chord. So with this, it's like I want it to mostly play this chord, but every once in a while, it's going to pick out another chord, right? So I'm going to go ahead and patch that into shift. We might want to reduce the modulation amount because shift is already almost all the way to the right. So it's like goes a little bit to the right and it goes a little bit rather clockwise, counterclockwise. It moves just a slightly away from where it normally goes, but you can hear we're now picking out other chords, and we're also altering the freeze on beads, right? So the other obvious choice for something to modulate on beads is going to be the timing control. So let's go ahead and just run mix into the time input, and then we're going to set time further away. This will sort of make it so that no matter what we do, it's going to alter the timing control, right? Mix is another one that it's simple, but it's quite useful for just having something that is always going to affect the output, right? So now let's turn this down and we can hear what the overall effect is, right? You can see sometimes certain notes get picked out, sometimes the chord changes, sometimes beads will freeze, whatever our most recent behavior was. And yeah, it's just a lot more dynamic of a way to alter all of these different parameters, right? So maybe let's go ahead and focus on another part of this patch. We have our baseline here, right? And let's see. So something that I like to use min for is to alter the phase modulation amount, right? So what I have patched up here is let's go ahead, I'll just show it to you. I know it's off screen, but basically this is what the phase modulation of the third oscillator that we're not hearing sounds like going into the main oscillator. And if I just go ahead and patch min into that, we're only going to get phase modulation when all the values are low or high, right? So this makes it so that the phase modulation only kicks in sometimes. Let me maybe change the harmonics so it's a little bit more obvious. It's a little bit more obvious, but you know, something else that I would like to be able to control is the envelope time. So I'm going to go ahead and run the max into the envelope time, and I'm going to run it into both of them because this is sort of a stereo patch, right? And what I think I'd like to do is take this, run it into both of them, and then turn the envelope time, the basis for the envelope time, all the way down, right? And then that way we kind of get the most out of it. It's usually a nice long envelope, but when all the values are low, then it becomes nice and plucky instead, right? So let's see. Obviously, another thing that I quite like to use Anna's step output for is note sequences. So I have the tree and leaves driving our 3 body, and I'm just going to go ahead and take the step out and run it into the transpose, right? So now this is all happening pre-quantizer, and you can hear sometimes we get the kind of sweeping sound, and sometimes we get it to just hold and then shift to another value, right? So it's actually going to have a pretty significant effect over the entire thing. But you know, if we wanted to maybe have less of an effect, we can run it through an attenuator or something first. I'm not going to bother with that. So now what we have so far is this this drone, this lovely drone. You can hear we're affecting the entire patch together at one time. I think I'm also gonna mult our magnitude input, right? Magnitude output, rather. I'm gonna have this going. I'm sorry if I just bonked the microphone into the control input. And then I'm gonna go ahead and patch it into both of these. Maybe open them up a little bit more from the basis. You can hear that what we're doing is having a pretty significant effect on the overall patch, right? It's hard to describe exactly what it is, but we can just sort of play around until we find something we like. And then change things from there on the rest of the patch. But, of course, this patch wouldn't be complete without drums, so let's go ahead and add those drums back in. As you might have noticed, I'm mixing this whole thing together with 3D VCAs. So let's see, we have our XOR. I think what we're gonna want is the min, again, going into the probability control, right? And what we want that for is and probability on IDUM, right? And why we want that is because we want to be able to have IDUM only kick on sometimes, right? But we're going to run the max into the length control so that when it does kick on, it makes a really long modification, right? And I think we're gonna take, you can hear now, every once in a while, the step on the step sequencer is holding for a while, right? We're gonna go ahead and take the XOR, and we're in multiply divide mode right now, so we're gonna, and the param knob is sitting at noon, right? So if I do this higher, you can hear we're getting some really fast multiplications. It's just affecting the drum machine right now. I don't have IDUM patched into any of the triggers going into the 3-body baseline, but we're using the note sequence manipulation from IDUM in order to affect that, right? So something nice about XOR is that it usually sits around 0, and so the variations that you get will go in either direction, but they're pretty limited in scope. So I'm gonna go ahead and patch XOR into the param knob. And yeah, we still have cut left, and I think what I might do for that is patch that into the smoothness control on tides. Or you know what? Let's do slope. I feel like when I'm using tides as a pad, modulating the slope gives me a really nice way to both like give a phase shifting sort of sound and also to change the amount of harmonics that the pad is giving us, right? So now I'm gonna go ahead and turn the decay on these drums down a tiny bit. And I'm gonna go ahead and start messing with Anna, right? You can hear already, it's made a large difference. Let's see, this is the min output. I'm gonna run that into the decay parameter on my hi-hat. So we're also just slightly tweaking the hi-hat. I need to turn the basis up a little bit because if we move that down, it's obviously going negative, but it's also opening the hi-hat up. Get this into a bunch of different zones and have a pretty drastic effect over the entire patch just by turning the two knobs on Anna, right? And so once I've gotten to a place that I like with everything going on Anna, that's when I start plugging in modulation, right? So I have a sort of slow tempo synced LFO coming from our Pamela's new workout. It's this one. You might barely be able to see the LED just sort of moving. Slow, going to the tempo. We're just gonna plug it into min input 1 and see what happens. Here, that LFO is kind of controlling the entire patch right now, right? I can change the knob settings and it'll set basically the range and the way that the LFO interacts with the patch, right? I can change, obviously, the attenuverter. And I have a second modulation output here coming from the slappy boundary. I'm going to go ahead and set it to cycle just for fun. And I'm going to take the output and I'm patching it into the sum over here. You can hear already that kind of makes the note output freak out. So I might patch this into something else. Let's go ahead and patch this into the mode on IDUM, right? You can hear it's getting a little crazy. But if I do a little bit of work, it's giving us something a little bit more sane, right? So, you know, this is a very kind of fly-by-night sort of way to use Anna. I normally wouldn't go with something and then just start plugging a ton of modulation in. Sometimes it can be good to start with the modulation and then find destinations for it. I personally really like having even sometimes two Annas that I'm using with no inputs just to process and sort of explore the space around my patch. I'll show an example with that in the demo video coming up. But you know, I think that it shows, for example, like, okay, let's ignore the LFO, and I'm going to go ahead and take one of the sequence outs from leaves, right? I'm going to patch that into the sum as well. You can see sometimes the sequencer output is off. But still, changing these knobs has a pretty drastic effect on everything that's going on. So, hopefully this shows you the power of using Anna's multiple outputs simultaneously. You don't need to use everything on Anna in order to get the most out of it, but I think showing you this patch where everything is patched into something gives you an idea, hopefully sparks some ideas of your own, and it shows you just how powerful this option can be. One of the coolest parts of Anna is that you can use a specific output for its intended purpose, and then you get all other of the 8 outputs for free. Hopefully next week we'll have a demo showing off some of this functionality. Thank you for watching.